How do we get more people back into this labor market? Because a lot of people have left, they're not being counted, but they need to come back if we're going to eat up some of this slack.
Right, so 4.2 million people have left the labor force since COVID struck, and many of them still face barriers to returning to work. We saw only 50,000 come back to the labor force in February, despite rising vaccination rates, despite falling COVID cases. Many people still just don't feel comfortable coming to work in person, and many of them would be prepared to work if they could do so remotely.
So is that the biggest issue, sort of the safety to get people back, or is the biggest issue as companies have had to rejigger how they function, that the right people aren't in the right jobs?
No, I think there are sort of three main problems. One is that people feel unsafe returning to work in many cases in person. The other is that many people just can't. They're forced not to go to work by the fact that more than half of the nation's schools are still closed and not offering in-person instruction. And in January, that was 36% of schools offering in-person instruction. That's now ticked upwards to 45%. So we're slowly moving in the right direction. But there are still hundreds of thousands, millions even, of parents who cannot go to a job that requires them to leave the home right now. And there are other problems, too, like reduced public transit safety and convenience and service. So it's very difficult for some people. And then this has been a huge psychological jolt for many job seekers. And for many, that shock has sort of kept them away. And they perhaps don't realize how quickly job postings are now rebounding. And they've really skyrocketed in February. And so I would encourage job seekers to look at the job market again and take a look at the opportunities that are out there, because they are on the rise. And the experience of looking for a job in March, April, May will be very different from the experience in December and January, which may have been discouraging.
Your data, the JOLTS data, is a forward-looking indicator. It gives us a good idea of where the labour market is going. As you say, those numbers are really starting to tick up at the moment. How strongly are they ticking up, Julia? And what would, therefore, you expect the labour market to look like in 2-3 months' time?
Sure. So in November, December, January, job postings were basically flat, and they even fell slightly. But in February, they just burst 18% over last month. They're now 15% higher than the pre-COVID peak in last February, which was a very strong number to begin with. So there are real signs that employers are taking courage in the COVID news that we're getting, the decline in cases, the acceleration in vaccinations, and the fact that we saw retail spending surge more than 5%, 5 times what we expected. It rose 5.3%. That's 5 times more than the growth that was expected. And so many employers found that the constraint facing them in February was supply constraints and capacity constraints, supply chain constraints. And so many realize now that with demand surging like this, they need to gear up again and get their workers back into the office and back into production facilities.
Julia, something that we also saw was unemployment by race. And I have a chart that I'll describe to you here. This breaks out that number by race and ethnicity, white Americans, black Americans, Hispanic Americans, and Asian Americans. All of those rates either declined or leveled out, with the exception of black Americans. It's that blue line there for those of you who can see that ticked up to 9.9%. What do we do about that?
Right. And so this pandemic really has had disproportionate effects on different people. The white male labor force fell by 2.2%, and that's a bad number. That's really terrible in and of itself. But the Hispanic female labor force has shrunk 4.4%, and the black female labor force has shrunk 5.6%. These are really, really staggering numbers, and we do need to do much more to reduce the barriers to people going back to work. Now, the huge growth we saw in leisure and hospitality jobs, that was really where the growth was concentrated this month, is encouraging, because those jobs are often the sort of first rung on the ladder. Those are jobs where we see lots of low-income workers, people who haven't gone to college. Many of those service industries, like salons, disproportionately employ women. And so the sign that they are sort of coming back to life and recovering again is very encouraging. And it means that those populations that have been hardest hit may have a chance of recovering.
Julia, I want to come back to the issue of female participation in the labour market as well. You talked about schools just a moment ago, and you talked about the impact that that has. That has disproportionately fallen on the female portion of the labour market. How difficult is it going to be to get those women back into the labour market? Once schools start to return full-time, once that issue of childcare is resolved, and we hope that that happens soon, is it as simple as flicking a switch and these women come back into the labour market? Are there structural problems to bringing them back? Because this is a problem that we have to solve.
Right, and I think one good thing about this crisis is that perhaps it has shone a spotlight on this issue. There is little support for childcare. There have been some very encouraging improvements in recent years, like expanded seats for early education in a number of states. But we really need to do more to support women in the labor force, and there are all kinds of exciting changes that we did see in the last 2 years that were having a huge effect. So female labor force participation was sort of growing at the same pace as male labor force participation until about 2015, and then women just broke away and they never looked back. And people were really encouraged to see how female prime age labor force participation just kept going up and up and up, and that was happening for a whole number of reasons. One is that women are increasingly moving into previously male-dominated industries, and that sets off a virtuous cycle. Another is that female-dominated industries are those that are growing fastest, like nursing, and that could just continue after this huge pause with COVID, but many of those trends could set right back in if the pandemic is not too sort of destigmatizing for women who've now been unemployed long term.
Such a great pleasure to talk to you, Julia. Thank you so very much. Julia Pollack of ZipRecruiter. Thank you. This is Bloomberg.